Welcome, everyone. It's Parsha Ki Tavo. This is a pre-recorded class. Next week, we will return to our usual format of live classes. But I'm so glad that you could come. Let's sing a little bit as people come on. Ding 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 die 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 ding ding die ding 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 die I die die ding ding die ding ding die 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 I die 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 ding 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 I ding ding die, ding ding die, ding ding die, hey ding ding die, and die, ding ding die, ding 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 die, hey ding die, ding ding die, ding ding die, die, I die, 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 I die, 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 hey die, 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 die. Yibane Amikdash Yirtzion Timale Yibane Amikdash Yirtzion Timale Visham Nashir Shir Chadash Uberanana ale B'shamna shir chadash Uberanana ale Yibane Amikdash Yirtzion Timale Yibane Amikdash Yirtzion Timale B'shamna shir chadash Uberanana ale B'shamna shir chadash Uberanana ale. Welcome, everyone. Parsha Ki Tavo. We're getting towards Rosh Hashanah, and the parsha says, and it will be when you come into the land. And then the Torah continues with the explanation of the mitzvah of bikurim, the first fruits. And in the Mishnah, there's the most beautiful, picturesque description of how people would bring their first fruits and how people would come up all together and from a particular village or city, and everyone would decorate their baskets, and they would take just the first fruits of the 7 fruits of Eretz Yisrael, and they put them in baskets, and they would put them on oxen, and they would come up to Yerushalayim, and it says all the people of Yerushalayim would come out and greet them, and they would bring up the baskets with the first fruits to the temple. And in the Parsha, it has it's called the confession. It's more a statement of thanks and praise to God. And in very short, it gives over the whole history of how we went down to Egypt and we were slaves, and God saved us and brought us to this wonderful land. And now I am bringing my first fruits in appreciation and thanksgiving. This short confession that is written here is actually the kernel, the basis of the Haggadah of Pesach. Because in the Haggadah of Pesach also we tell the whole story of our forefathers and going down to Egypt and being slaves and coming out and being saved and redeemed and brought to Eretz Yisrael. So that is the kernel of the story of the Haggadah. Now, in this description, it mentions a phrase that has been mentioned many times in the Torah when we talk about Eretz Yisrael, and that's Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, a land flowing with milk and honey. And this short description of Eretz Yisrael is repeated many times in the Torah, including in this very significant mitzvah of Bikurim. So tonight, I wanted to go deeper into this phrase, and by extension, into the special qualities of Eretz Yisrael. So the first thing we're going to point out is that one of the places that this phrase is mentioned is in Parshat Ve'etchanan, at the end of the 5th Aliyah. We divide each parsha into 7 parts when we read it publicly. And the end of the 5th one ends with the words, Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, a land flowing in milk and honey. And then right after that, the beginning of the 6th Aliyah is Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And the first passage of the 3 passages of the Shema, and you shall love God, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And so I learned from Rav Ginsburg that the juxtaposition of this description of Eretz Yisrael with the Shema, which is considered the cardinal statement of faith in the Torah, in Judaism, is that first of all, we look at the last letters of Eretz, Davash, Chalav, Davash. Eretz, Chalav, Davash. Eretz is an Aleph. Chalav is a Chet. Davash is a Dalet. Aleph, Chet, and Dalet spells out Echad, which is the final word of the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. God is one. So from this we learn that the revelation of godliness, the awareness of the unity of God, is more pronounced in Eretz Yisrael than any other place. And I think anyone who has been to Eretz Yisrael knows how true this is. I've heard from countless people who made it to Israel just once in their life, maybe twice. And so many have the same reaction is, when I was in Israel, I felt like I was home. Now, this is coming from a person who spent 2 weeks here, maybe 2 weeks twice in their lifetime, lived somewhere else their whole life. And when they came to Israel, they really meant it. I know the first time I came, within days, that was my experience also. It's like, I'm home. This is home. And that feeling goes along with a certain awareness of not just Jewish history, but a certain consciousness of the unity of God that is here, the presence of God. And this is so much so that it says in the Talmud a pretty radical statement where it says, someone who lives outside of the land of Israel, it's as if they have no God. Now, the sages did not mean this literally, because as we know, we spent most of our history outside the land of Israel. And we had so many righteous people and so many great wise people. So you can't say that people had no awareness of God, but they wanted to point out in comparison to Eretz Yisrael, it's as if a person doesn't have a God. There's a very, very famous quote from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who came to Eretz Yisrael, and he actually spent, I believe, close to 6 months here, maybe even a little bit more. And then he went back to Europe, and he never made it back to Israel. And when people used to ask him, just a simple, like, where are you going? He would say, I'm always going to Eretz Yisrael. Because once he was here, he understood, even though he didn't remain here, he understood this is the headquarters of every Jew, Jewish history, the Torah, and of godliness. So this idea that the Rashi Tavo, the acronym of Eretz Halav Devash, a land of milk and honey, is the oneness that is revealed in the Shema. So there's another way that we refer to Eretz Yisrael, and it's called Eretz Tzvi, the land of the deer. So what's the connection, other than the fact that the deer is just such a beautiful, graceful animal, and they're indigenous to Eretz Yisrael? But the mystical teaching is that the numerical value of Tzvi, Sadi Bet Yud, equals 102, which equals the word emunah, faith. So when we call the land of Israel Eretz Tzvi, it's a reference that Eretz Yisrael is a land of faith. Now, this faith works in two directions. In other words, on what merit did we come back to Eretz Yisrael after 2,000 years? So we could probably answer that in many ways, but the undeniable fact is we never lost our faith that we would come back. It was engraved in us that our homeland is Eretz Yisrael, and most people who prayed 3 times a day, it's mentioned in the Amidah, the cardinal prayer of Judaism, the desire and the prayer to return to Jerusalem. And every time we say grace after meals, we ask God to rebuild Jerusalem. And we just simply did not give up our faith that the prophets said in God's name that one day God will bring the Jewish people back to the land. And it took 2,000 years. I know that's kind of like a platitude at this point because we quote it so many times, but a platitude becomes a platitude because it's so true. So this is Eretz Tzvi, it's the land of faith. So it was the faith that we would come back, but on the reverse side, or the mirror image, the other side of the coin, is that when we are in Israel, it strengthens our faith in our destiny as a people, in our history, in our connection to the Torah, our connection to each other, and our connection to God. And our faith in all of these things is heightened, is increased in Eretz Yisrael. So it takes faith to come to Eretz Yisrael, but when you're in Eretz Yisrael, it builds our faith. it works in both directions. Now, there's another mystical secret here, is that there are alternative alphabets in Kabbalah. And one of them is just called Atbash, Aleph, Tav, Bet, Shin. And this is a type of alphabet where we exchange an Aleph for a Tav, meaning for the first letter from the last letter, a Bet for a Shin, the second letter for the second last letter, and so on through all of the letters. And through that, deep secrets of the Torah are revealed. So if you take the letters Tzvi in Atbash, it's the exchanged letters for the name Moshe. In other words, the mem of Moshe is exchanged for a yud, the last letter of Tzvi. The shin of Moshe, which is the second last letter, is exchanged for the second letter, which is a bet. And the hey of Moshe, which is the fifth letter, is exchanged for the fifth last letter, which is a tzadi. So the name Moshe in Atbash equals Tzvi. It's the land of Moshe. Now, this is very paradoxical because Moshe didn't enter into the land. And if you remember, we learned this a few weeks ago in Parshat Ve'etchanan, the same parsha of the Shema, where Moshe prays 515 prayers to come into the land of Israel. And so even though he didn't make it, and it appears that his prayers were not answered, but in a very, very deep way, they were answered because he engraved in the heart and soul and mind of the Jewish people never to give up our faith in coming to Eretz Yisrael. And it was Moshe who led us for 40 years in the desert, from the Exodus from Egypt up to the borders of Eretz Yisrael. And so really on his merit, very much on Moshe's merit, we eventually came into the land. And in the Zohar, so Moshe is called Raya Mehemna, the shepherd of faith. That's his name in the Zohar. He was the shepherd of faith. And again, we have this idea because the name Moshe in this alphabet called Atbash equals Tzvi, the deer, which equals Emunah, faith. So Moshe is the shepherd of faith. And why is he called a shepherd? So the obvious answer is, as the leader of Bnei Yisrael for 40 years, he was the shepherd, and we, as it were the sheep. We were the flock. There's a very beautiful midrash of why God picked Moshe to be the leader. This goes back to when Moshe is living with his wife, who is the daughter of Yitro, and he was the shepherd of Yitro's flocks. And the midrash says that one day he noticed that one of the sheep was gone, had disappeared. And so instead of sending one of the other shepherds, he took responsibility and he went looking for this little sheep. And the midrash says he finally found the sheep, and the sheep was standing on a rock that had a small crevice in the rock with a tiny bit of water. And it was very thirsty, and it was drinking the water. And so Moshe Rabbeinu said to himself, "Oi, it's like my fault. Obviously, the sheep was so thirsty, it wandered off looking for something to drink. And so he put the sheep on his back, and he walked the sheep back to the rest of the flock. And the Midrash concludes with God saying, this is the shepherd that I want for my people. So it's a very, very beautiful Midrash, and it's connected to this way that we refer to Moshe Rabbeinu as the shepherd of faith, Raya Mehemna. Now, we'll visit the incident with the spies for a moment. That when the 12 spies came back, as we know, 10 of them said the land is beautiful. And remember, they brought these huge fruits back to show that this is an amazing land. But the people there are too strong for us. We will not be able to go there. We will not be able to defeat them. And of course, that night, according to tradition, was Tisha B'Av. And the people stood at the tents and cried. And they said, let's pick a new leader and go back to Egypt. And so two of the other spies, Caleb and Yoshua, so they of course disagreed with the 10 spies and says, yes, we can go in there. God promised to bring us there. Of course we can go. And they concluded their plea to the people, and they said, Tova ha'aretz ma'od ma'od. The land is very, very good. Ma'od ma'od. Tova ha'aretz ma'od ma'od. And another teaching I learned from Rav Ginsburg was that this phrase, Tova ha'aretz ma'od ma'od, equals 408, which is 4 times the word emunah. Emunah is 102. And this phrase is 408, which is 4 times emunah. Now, there's a technique or a method that if a phrase or a verse, you take how many words in the verse, and you divide the entire gematria, the entire numerical value of the whole verse, in order to get what's called the common denominator. So here, if we have 4 words making up the phrase, and the phrase equals 4 times emunah, it means that the average value of each of the words is emunah. So it really is 4 times emunah, like 4 doses of faith. So this is how Caleb and Yoshua describe the land. That it's a good land, but a very, very good land. So this word ma'od, so we brought it already in when we're talking about the Shema. When we say the first passage, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol me'odecha, which is you shall love God your God with all your heart, with all your soul. And it's usually translated with all of your might. The sages pointed out that it also means, maybe even more fundamentally, with all of your means, all of your financial means, you shall love God. In other words, in doing the mitzvot, in doing charity, we should not hold back, but we should do it with our full financial being. But the word ma'od also, if you permute the letters, are the same letters as Adam, a human being. So in Chassidut, it's explained, what does it mean with all of your might? It means with all of your being, with all of your humanness, with all of your essence. And this is one of the secrets of Eretz Yisrael. One of the secrets of Eretz Yisrael is that it's not just this idea that the concept of one God is most revealed there, but the idea of one God means much more than there is one God. It means that in essence, everything is one. What in science, they call it now the theory of everything, because they're looking for the theory that will bring all of the forces of the universe together in one formula to show that in essence, everything is connected. Everything is connected. Einstein began this search. He called it the unified field theory, because he understood that there was a unity between all the different parts of the physical universe. So that is the consciousness of Eretz Yisrael, not just that there's one God, but the understanding of the unity. And that, remember, that goes back to Eretz Chalav Devash, a land of milk and honey. So now I'll give over one more explanation of why the land is called Eretz Tzvi, the land of the deer. So it's explained, and anyone who's seen a deer, the skin on a deer is incredibly taut. So if they say that if a deer is killed and skinned, and you would try to put the skin back on the deer, it would be impossible, because it's so stretched, so taut, that it would be impossible. So what does this have to do with Eretz Yisrael? So the idea is that if you look at a map today and throughout history, you could barely see Israel on a map. It's like it's so small that it kind of gets almost, it depends how big the map is, but even a big map, Eretz Yisrael, usually if you put the name Israel, it's like bigger than the amount of space it takes up on the map. And Israel's always been a small geographical place. And this is one of the mysteries of Eretz Yisrael, that the expression is the little that holds a lot. This is said about the letter Yud. The letter Yud is the smallest of the letters, but it's the first letter of God's name. And therefore, it's like the point of the Big Bang, that this almost infinitely small speck of, we'll call it matter or energy, there's the Big Bang, and the universe is still expanding to tens of billions of galaxies, each galaxy having tens of billions of stars. And it all came from one speck. The speck is almost not even the right word for it. It's too big. So the Yud of God's name represents the little that holds a lot. And that is used to explain the secret of Eretz Yisrael, that it's the smallest geographical place. And in the Torah, about the people of Israel, God says, you are the smallest. Ma'at mikol ha'amim. You're the smallest of all the people. And we know that throughout history, that as percentage-wise, we make up such a small fraction of even 1%. It's a very tiny fraction of 1% of the world's population. And yet, look what we have produced in far as human development. So I want to end this class that this concept has always fascinated me. It's a very, very deep idea throughout Kabbalah and Chassidut, how the infinite light of God is found in the finite world, which is somewhat oxymoronic. It's a paradoxical statement. Either something's finite or it's infinite. And yet there's this idea, the typical Jewish idea, that they can both coexist, that the infinite essence of God can also be experienced and felt within the finite. And in fact, that is what's called the secret of all of the mitzvot, because all of the mitzvot are very precise. When we learn the halacha of a mitzvah, there's a certain time, a certain place, a certain blessing, a certain way that we do a mitzvah. And it's all within very, very finite parameters. And yet when we do a mitzvah, we connect to the infinite light of God. So this is a very, very deep concept. It's a paradoxical concept, but paradoxes are true, even though they appear to be mutually exclusive. They are true. So this is a poem that I wrote, and so I want to read it for you. And it basically encompasses this idea, the infinite in the finite, but in relationship to Eretz Israel. And it's called From the Galilee to the Galaxy. By the waterfall in Nachal Hermon, I sat in wonder and in awe. Nature's divine face reflected in the rushing water and trees so tall. I meditated on the land given to us so long ago, and the deep connection over millennium that keeps us returning, a constant river flow. From the Galilee to the galaxy, from the Kinneret to the Golan, from the Eilat mountains to En Gedi, from the Holy Land to the infinite beyond. The snow-capped Hermon in its majesty, the world's largest natural crater in Mitzpeh Ramon, the lowest point on earth by the Dead Sea, a divine spark in every valley, tree, and stone. The whole world in miniature is found in this mysterious place, the secret of time eternal, and the elasticity of space. For within borders so very small is contained so very much. Within temporal reality is hidden a mystical touch, opening the portals of the heart while enlightening the mind, giving us a sense of purpose and unbounded treasures to find. From the Galilee to the galaxy, from Lake Kinneret to the Golan, from the Eilat mountains to En Gedi, from the Holy Land to the infinite beyond. So I'm going to end with a blessing that we all stay connected to Eretz Israel, even if we can only come once or twice or 3 times in our lifetime, that this is home. This is where the whole Messianic era will unfold. And ultimately, all Jews will come back to Israel, and the light of Israel will spread to the whole world, and the infinite will be manifest in the finite. Thank you all for coming. Next week, we return to live broadcasts. Thanks so much for coming.